The first thing I remember is the sound silverware clinking against crystal, the low hum of wedding chatter, the soft shuffle of guests drifting across the ballroom like a tide I didn't belong to. I stood near the back wall, fingers curled around a champagne flute I hadn't sipped from, half hidden by a pillar wrapped in flowers that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. And then I felt a hand clamping around my arm hard enough to bruise. My father's voice followed sharp and controlled the way it always got right before he said something unforgivable. "Leave now. She doesn't want you here." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking, but his jaw was tight, his eyes cold, and the guests around us kept laughing and posing for photos, unaware that my world was cracking open in the middle of the celebration. I looked across the room and saw my sister, my only sibling, smiling in her wedding gown, pretending she couldn't see me at all. I walked out without a single word. I didn't cry. Not then. But the next morning, when my father called and said he needed my land papers, something inside me shifted so suddenly it felt like a bone snapping clean. I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone still buzzing from his latest call, the 49th in 2 days. My thumb hovered over the screen before I finally set the phone face down on the quilt. Outside, early summer light slid across the yard, catching in the branches of the old sycamores my mother planted when I was a child. The house felt too quiet, too heavy, like it was holding its breath right along with me. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours since the wedding. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's fingers digging into my arm and heard the words he chose over me. "Leave now. She doesn't want you here." I pushed myself up and walked into the kitchen, the one place in this house that still felt like mine. The scent of coffee grounds lingered from the night before. Mismatched plates were stacked on the drying rack beside the sink, and the window over the counter looked out on the 40 acres my mother left to me when she died. Acres she protected fiercely. Acres my father always believed should have gone to him, or later to my sister. He never forgave my mother for choosing me. And now, after humiliating me at the wedding, he wanted the papers to that land, as if ripping it from me would somehow fix the mess he had made for himself. I opened the drawer where I kept the manila envelope containing every document tied to that property. The original deed, the updated survey lines, my mother's handwritten note reminding me to protect this place when I'm gone. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. Instead, I traced the edge of the drawer with my fingertips, thinking about the drive home from the wedding, the way the highway lights blurred through my tears, the way I told myself over and over that there had to be a reason, some explanation other than the one I'd been handed. Maybe Harper had a panic attack. Maybe she and I miscommunicated. Maybe my father misunderstood something. But the truth was simpler and sharper than any excuse. They didn't want me there. My existence at her wedding had been an inconvenience, an embarrassment, something to remove quietly and quickly, so the photographs would reflect the perfect family image they preferred. My father beaming beside his younger daughter, the one he always claimed was fragile, sensitive, in need of a little more from him, and me, the older one, the one who'd always been told to be understanding. My phone buzzed again on the counter. This time, I let it ring all the way through. The voicemail alert blinked up after a few seconds. But I didn't listen. Instead, I stepped onto the back porch and let the warm air settle against my skin. The pasture stretched wide in every direction, a patchwork of wild grasses and bright morning sun. It was the only place that had ever felt safe. I had grown up believing my mother gave it to me because she trusted I would take care of it. Now I was starting to wonder if she left it to me because she knew exactly what my father would do if it ever fell into his hands. A car engine hummed faintly on the road in the distance, too early for visitors, too steady to be a neighbor. My heart kicked hard once before settling. Not today, I thought. Whoever it was, whatever this new crisis my father thought he could push onto me, it could wait. I wasn't ready to face him or my sister or anyone who believed I owed them something, simply because they were louder, needier, or more demanding. I went back inside and poured myself a glass of water, letting the coolness ground me. Then, with hands that finally stopped shaking, I picked up my phone and blocked my father's number. I would unblock it later, just long enough to tell him something I hadn't quite formed yet. Something final. But for now, the silence was a relief. I glanced once more toward the drawer with the land papers. Not today, I repeated to myself, but soon. Something was changing inside me slowly, steadily, like a tide that didn't intend to recede. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I only knew this, whatever came next wouldn't look anything like the past. And for the first time since the wedding, that thought didn't terrify me. It steadied me. It almost felt like the beginning of something I could finally call mine. The call came at 9:43 in the morning, right when I finally thought the house might give me a moment of peace. I'd blocked my father's number the night before, but I hadn't blocked unknown callers, and that was my mistake. The phone buzzed across the counter, the vibration sharp enough to rattle a spoon beside it. I almost let it ring out of spite, but something in my chest tightened an instinct I didn't trust anymore but still found myself obeying. I answered without saying anything. A man's voice came through the line, smooth and polite in a way that felt practiced. "Is this Ms. Hartley?" His tone made my skin prickle. "Yes," I said slowly. "Who's calling?" There was a soft clearing of the throat, like he was preparing himself for a pitch. "My name is Grant. I'm with Ridgeway Appraisal Services. We spoke a few months ago about your property." My heart thudded, once heavy and confused. We had never spoken. Not once. I told him as much. Silence followed, brief but telling. Then he recovered. "Oh, well, your father mentioned that you'd be expecting my call. He said you were preparing to move forward." "Move forward with what?" My voice was sharp now. No attempt at politeness. "Your property's preliminary valuation," he replied. "The appraisal. We sent the full report last week." I stared at the counter as if the wood grain could offer an explanation. "I haven't requested any appraisal. I haven't authorized anything. And you certainly didn't send me anything." Another pause. Then the man lowered his voice like he was suddenly nervous. "Ms. Hartley, your father, he told us you were selling the land. He said you just needed a few formalities handled." A slow, icy burn crawled up the back of my neck. Selling the land. My land. The land my mother left only to me. The land my father had always insisted should have been his. The land he'd pressured me about for years in ways I pretended not to see, smaller schemes and quiet comments I dismissed because they seemed too petty to take seriously. But this wasn't petty. I steadied my breath and asked him if he could resend whatever he supposedly sent. When the email arrived less than a minute later, I opened it with dread settling into my bones. The report was dated 2 weeks before Harper's wedding. Not a single page bore my signature, but another document attached a letter of intent did. Except the signature wasn't mine. It looked like mine, a near-perfect imitation. But the curve on the A in Hartley tilted the wrong direction, and the loops on the T were too wide. My mother used to tell me handwriting was like a fingerprint no two ever truly matched, and this wasn't mine. A cold realization settled over me. My father had forged it, or he'd allowed someone else to forge it. Either way, the intention was the same: remove me from the equation long enough to secure what he wanted. "Ms. Hartley," the man on the phone said carefully. "I assumed everything was legitimate. Your father was very convincing. If you're not selling, I need to halt this immediately." "Do that," I said, "and send me all correspondence tied to this appraisal. Every document, every email, every request. Of course, I'm sorry for the confusion." He hung up quickly, as if afraid he'd already said too much. I lowered the phone and braced my hands on the kitchen island. The room felt smaller than it had minutes earlier. The air felt heavier. Something inside me cracked open, not in a fragile way, but in a way that revealed something underneath, something sharp-edged and long ignored. My father didn't just humiliate me at Harper's wedding. He was laying groundwork, preparing to use my absence, an absence he forced to justify claiming the land. My mother had seen this in him years ago. I knew she had. She'd left the land to me for a reason. She'd whispered, "Promise me you'll protect it," when she was too tired to sit up in bed. Her fingers curled around mine, her voice thin but fierce. I had promised, and I was going to keep that promise. I pushed off the counter and retrieved the manila envelope from the drawer. I set it on the table and took a seat, sliding out each document with a care I hadn't shown before. Deeds, survey lines, water rights filings, tax records, my mother's letter. I read them slowly as though the words themselves were a kind of armor. And maybe they were. Every line reminded me that this land was not something to barter. Not something to inherit through entitlement. Not something to bully out of my hands. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. Unknown number. "We need to talk about the land. Call me back." Dad. I stared at the message without breathing. He wasn't even pretending anymore. A second text came through immediately after. "Don't make this difficult." Difficult. The same word he used at the wedding. The same word he'd used throughout my childhood whenever I didn't fold under his expectations. A laugh escaped me, humorless and low. Difficult was what he called me when I had boundaries. I picked up the phone not to call him, but to search online for property attorneys in my area. It took 15 minutes before I found one who specialized in land disputes and inheritance conflicts, Dana Whitford. Her photo showed a woman with sharp eyes and a steady expression. I hit the number listed beneath her name. Dana's receptionist answered warm and efficient, and when I explained briefly what was happening, her tone shifted. Urgent. Concerned. "Can you come in today?" she asked. I glanced at the stack of documents, at my mother's handwriting on the envelope, at the sun cutting across the kitchen tile. "Yes," I said. "I can." And for the first time since the moment my father grabbed my arm at that wedding, I felt something real settle in my chest. Not fear, not grief, resolve. Dana's office sat above an old insurance agency on Main Street, the kind of building with creaking steps and tall windows that let in too much sun. I arrived 10 minutes early, clutching the manila folder to my chest like someone might try to snatch it away. The waiting room was quiet, lined with framed certificates and local landscape photos, scenes of the same foothills my land sat on. For a moment, the familiarity of it grounded me. Then the door beside me opened and a woman with a sharp bob and steady gaze stepped out. "You must be Ms. Hartley," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dana." Her handshake was firm, her eyes assessing without being unkind. She ushered me into her office, a space filled with dark wood furniture shelves of neatly organized binders and a single plant thriving in the sunlight beside her desk. "Sit wherever you're comfortable." Comfortable wasn't a word I recognized anymore, but I chose the chair closest to the edge of the rug, the one that made escape easiest. Dana folded her hands and nodded for me to begin. "Start at the beginning," she said. "Don't rush." It was strange how easily the words came. I told her about the wedding, about my father's hand on my arm, about the humiliation I'd swallowed without protest. I told her about the calls, the appraisal company, the forged letter of intent, the text messages that shifted from polite to demanding to unmistakably threatening. I told her about my mother's letter, the way she had warned me to protect the land. Dana didn't interrupt. She didn't frown or gasp or flinch. She simply took notes, her pen gliding across a yellow legal pad, like she'd heard versions of this story more times than she cared to admit. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. "First, I want you to understand something. Your father has no legal claim to your property. None. The deed is solely in your name and your mother's intent is very clear. He can't sell it, mortgage it, or authorize any changes without your consent." "Then how did he get that appraisal company involved?" I asked. Dana tapped her pen against the pad. "He misrepresented himself as someone with authority over the property. It happens more often than people realize. Appraisers don't verify ownership until later in the process. Still forging your signature. That's serious. My stomach tightened. Will he get in trouble? That depends on how far he takes this, Dana replied. Right now, the priority is protecting you and the land. Tell me, did anyone else contact you besides your father and the appraiser? I hesitated. There was the unknown number, the text saying not to make this difficult. Someone took a photo of my property from the tree line. I didn't mention that yet, I realized. She paused her note-taking. A photo. Someone sent it yesterday, along with a warning. Dana's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakably alert. That's more than family pressure. That's leverage. Maybe intimidation. Either way, you did the right thing coming here. She stood and crossed to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick binder labeled Property Defense Private Land. When she sat again, she flipped to a tab titled Unauthorized Interference. Your father's actions follow a pattern, she explained. When people are desperate financially, emotionally, or socially, they escalate quickly. And he has allies. Your sister, her husband, whoever this developer is behind the scenes. Family disputes become legal disputes the moment money enters the picture. I swallowed hard. So what do I do? Several things. But first we establish a paper trail. She slid a form toward me. Write down every contact he's made, every threat, every request for documents. And I want copies of all texts and emails. I nodded, pulling out my phone. Next, Dana continued. We'll place a notice with the county clerk. It prevents any unauthorized transactions involving your land. That means no surprise filings, no secret deals, no one slipping forged documents into the system. Relief washed through me slowly, like warmth returning to numb fingers. And long-term, I asked. Long-term, there are legal instruments that can protect the land beyond your lifetime. Trusts, conservation designations. Options we can discuss depending on your goals. My goals. Such a strange phrase. For years, my goals had been simple. Keep the peace, keep my distance, keep what was mine quietly and without conflict. But after the wedding, after the forged signature, after the morning phone call, something fundamental had changed. I didn't want to keep the peace anymore. I wanted control, protection, permanence. Dana's voice softened. I know this is overwhelming, but you're not alone in this. You have right, strong ones, and we can handle this methodically. Your father is counting on you being scared, confused, emotional. The moment you stop responding to that tactic, the dynamic shifts. I met her eyes. The shift had already begun somewhere between the slammed door at the wedding and the forged document with my almost signature on it. What do you need from me now? I asked. She smiled faintly. Just your cooperation. And that folder. I handed it over. She opened it carefully, skimming through the contents with deliberate precision. When she paused at my mother's handwritten note, her expression softened just a bit more. She wanted you to protect it, Dana said quietly. I think she knew this day would come. I felt a pressure behind my ribs, grief threaded with resolve. Then I'll protect it, I whispered. No matter what. Good, Dana said. Because the people coming after it won't stop easily. A chill moved down my spine, but underneath it was something steadier, firmer. This time neither would I. The drive home from Dana's office felt shorter than it should have, like my mind had collapsed time into a single long inhale. By the time I pulled into my gravel driveway, the afternoon heat shimmered above the fields, and the house stood quiet, waiting. I carried the binder Dana gave me to the kitchen table and set it beside my mother's envelope. The moment my hand let go of it, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't done being afraid, not even close, but fear wasn't the one steering anymore. I took a few minutes to breathe before opening the binder again, running my fingers along the tabs Dana had marked in red. Property rights, evidence log, unauthorized interference. Each section felt like a shield being slowly assembled. I thought maybe I'd get a few hours before the next storm hit. I was wrong. My phone buzzed against the tabletop. Not a call, a text. Unknown number. We need your signature to proceed. Please confirm availability for inspection. Inspection. The word punched the air from my lungs. They weren't slowing down. They weren't waiting for me to respond or negotiate or even breathe. They were moving ahead as if my permission was an irritating technicality. My pulse thudded in my ears. I typed back a single sentence: I did not authorize an inspection. Do not contact me again. A few seconds passed, then 3 dots appeared like a taunt. Your father said otherwise. I stared at the message until the letters blurred. Then I locked my phone, grabbed my keys, and drove straight back toward town. If I didn't talk to the appraiser in person, I was going to suffocate on suspicion. Ridgeway Appraisal Services operated out of a modest beige building behind a grocery store. I recognized the name on the door immediately. Inside, a man with thinning hair and a carefully knotted tie looked up from his computer. His eyes widened when he saw me. Ms. Hartley. He stood abruptly, knocking a pen to the floor. I didn't expect. You sent me messages, I cut in. About an inspection. About my father. Let's talk. He swallowed hard. Could we step into the conference room? The conference room was little more than a glass-walled cubicle with a table meant for 2 and a stack of promotional brochures showing suburban developments. I sat. He sat more slowly, like he expected the chair to collapse underneath him. Ms. Hartley, he began. I'm really sorry about the confusion. Your father was insistent that you two were coordinating together. He told us you were preparing to sell the land. He said you were just overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. The same word my father used any time I set a boundary he didn't like. I leaned forward. Did you not check ownership before initiating anything? We did, he said quickly. But since your father provided your information and said you'd be signing documents soon, we assumed. You assumed wrong. He flinched, nodding vigorously. I understand that now. And I've already halted the appraisal. We won't proceed without your authorization. Good, I replied. And the forged signature. His face reddened. I didn't know it was forged. Your father emailed it at 2 a.m. I thought, you thought I was awake at 2 a.m. signing away 40 acres of land. He sagged in his chair like a punctured tire. I see how that sounds. I had no more patience for apologies. I stood smoothing my hands down my shirt. I need copies of everything. Every email, every document, every request. Send them to me and to my attorney. Today. He nodded again, grateful to be dismissed. Outside, the heat pressed down on me like a hand between my shoulder blades. I sat in my car with the engine running, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. They had already taken steps onto my land. They had already planned an inspection. They had forged my name, contacted appraisers, pretended to speak for me. And not once, not a single time, had they thought I might push back. When I got home, the sun was sinking low, painting the fields in copper light. I walked the property line slowly, letting the earth steady me. Grass brushed my calves. The oak trees my mother loved stood tall and unbothered, their shadows stretching long across the ground. This land was older than my father's greed, older than my sister's entitlement, older than every mistake our family had piled onto it, and they thought they could bulldoze history just because it was convenient for them. As I reached the old fence post near the west corner, something caught my eye, fresh footprints in the dirt. Not mine, heavy circular treads. Someone had walked the perimeter recently. Someone had stood where I was standing now. A gust of wind rustled the leaves overhead, but it wasn't enough to chase the chill sliding down my spine. I followed the tracks a few yards before they disappeared into the brush. Whoever it was hadn't wanted to be seen. Not by me. Not yet. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me back. A text from Dana. Got your documents. We need to meet again first thing tomorrow. I slipped the phone away and looked back at the fields one more time. My mother used to say the land spoke to her quiet and patient. Tonight it felt like it was speaking to me. They're coming. And I'm not running. Not this time. The cedar box was heavier than I remembered. I carried it from the back closet to the kitchen table with both hands, setting it down gently, as though whatever was inside might break. The wood smelled faintly of lavender, the same scent my mother used to tuck between folded linens. I sat for a long moment staring at the brass hinges, trying to steady my breathing. Then I lifted the lid. Inside, everything was arranged with a care that made my throat tighten. My mother had never done anything halfway. Faded photographs lay tucked beneath envelopes, a folded map rested beside a leather-bound notebook, and a small silver locket sat in the corner, its chain coiled like it was waiting to be worn again. I touched it lightly, remembering her warm fingers fastening it around my neck on my 10th birthday. But it was the sealed envelope with my name written in her looping handwriting that pulled the air from my lungs. I picked it up carefully, sliding a finger beneath the flap. The paper inside was thin, softened by time. My mother's voice felt close as I unfolded it. "My sweet girl," her letter began. "If you're reading this, it means the weight has moved to your hands. I wish I could carry it for you longer, but I trust you. I always have. Protect this place. Not everyone deserves what they demand." I blinked hard, but tears still gathered. She'd seen it coming, maybe not exactly like this, but close enough. She knew who my father was when pushed. She knew the patterns Harper absorbed without question. She knew I'd one day be standing alone with the land and the pressure to give it up. I read the letter twice, then 3 times, until the words sank deep enough that they felt carved into me. When I finally set it aside, my hands were trembling not from fear, but from recognition. She'd been preparing me for this. I just hadn't realized it. Next, I pulled out the folder tucked beneath the photographs. Inside was a draft agreement from a conservation trust dated over a decade ago. My mother had handwritten notes in the margins. Questions about long-term protections, wildlife corridors, watershed preservation. A yellow sticky note clung to the top of the folder, the ink slightly smudged. Dana said this is the safest option if things get worse. Dana, the same attorney now helping me. My mother had known her first. I pressed the sticky note to my chest for a second before setting it down. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a stroke of luck. My mother had placed a path beneath my feet long before I ever needed to walk it. Beneath the agreement lay another bundle: environmental studies. I flipped through them slowly. Rare plant species documented along the eastern ridge. Migratory bird routes crossing directly over our fields. A freshwater spring that fed into a protected creek system. The deeper I read, the more I realized the truth: my mother hadn't loved the land just for its beauty. It mattered ecologically. It was worth protecting for reasons far bigger than our family's dysfunction. I felt a slow spark of pride warm through me. They wanted to carve it up for profit. My mother wanted to preserve it for generations that hadn't even been born yet. And now it was my turn to choose. As I lifted the last stack of documents, a page slid free and drifted onto the table. I reached for it, confused at first by its formal formatting. Then my breath caught. It was a notarized renunciation form. Signed by my father. 28 years old, the date read. He'd relinquished any future claim to the land after some dispute I'd been too young to remember. My mother must have kept the original proof, knowing someday it might protect me. My father had lied. Boldly, repeatedly, aggressively. He'd stood at the wedding and acted like I didn't belong in the family, and all the while he'd known he had already signed away the right to demand anything from me. A memory surfaced me at 12 years old, sitting on the staircase while my parents argued behind a closed door. My mother's voice breaking as she said, "I won't let you jeopardize her future." My father slamming the door on his way out into the night. I hadn't known then what they were fighting about. Now I did. I gathered every document into a neat stack, my mother's letter on top, and slid them into a new folder labeled in my mother's same phrasing. Protection. Just as I finished, a pounding knock startled me so hard the chair scraped against the tile. Someone was on my porch. I froze for a second before walking to the door and peering through the peephole. It was my Aunt Evelyn. She hadn't visited my house in years. Her eyes darted around like she didn't want to be seen. When she noticed movement behind the glass, she pressed her hand to the door. "We need to talk," she whispered urgently, "before your father does something he can't undo." My pulse hammered against my ribs. Whatever storm I thought was coming, it was already here. I unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting her in. Evelyn stepped inside like someone expecting the floor to give out beneath her. She kept glancing toward the windows as if my father might appear at any moment. I'd never seen her like this, nervous, unsettled, guilty. She didn't sit until I motioned her toward a chair at the table right beside the open folder of my mother's documents. She took one look at the papers, then at my face, and exhaled shakily. "He's spiraling," she said softly. "Your father. He's not thinking clearly. I tried to stop him, but—" She shook her head. "He won't listen to anyone now." "What did he do?" I asked. Evelyn clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "He's been borrowing money from people who don't lend out of kindness. He owes a large amount, and he promised them he'd have the money soon. He told them the land was already yours in name only, that you were preparing to sign it over." She bit her lip. "And he told the whole family you just needed a little push." I felt my stomach drop. A little push. The wedding. The humiliation. The pressure. The forged documents. He'd planned it all. Evelyn's voice grew quieter. "He said the developer was expecting movement by the end of this month, and that Harper was finally going to get what she deserved." My sister. Of course. I opened the folder and slid the renunciation document toward Evelyn. "He signed this years ago," I said. "He's known all along he had no claim." Evelyn read the paper, blinking rapidly. "Oh my God. He told everyone the land was practically his. He said your mother meant for Harper to have it one day." Anger rose hot and sharp. "My mother left it to me. Only me. She wanted it protected." Evelyn pressed her hands to her face. "Karen, I'm so sorry. I didn't know the lies went this deep." Before I could respond, a loud knock rattled the door hard enough to shake a picture frame on the hallway wall. Evelyn froze. I looked through the peephole and felt every muscle in my body tense. My father, Harper, Harper's husband, and behind them 2 cousins I hadn't spoken to in months, all of them crowded on my porch. They were here to corner me. Evelyn whispered, "Don't let them in, just be careful." I opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. My father stepped forward immediately, his expression a mask of performative calm. "Open the door," he demanded. "We need to talk. Now." "No," I said. His eyes narrowed. "This is family business." Harper sniffled dramatically behind him. "We came here in good faith," she said, her voice trembling. "We just want to fix things, as if I had broken them." My father leaned in. "Your sister is hurting. She needs a home. This land is our family's future. Your mother would want you to share." I felt Evelyn shift behind me, silently urging me not to break. I kept my voice steady. "The land is mine. It is not up for discussion." The calm cracked instantly. My father's face reddened. "Don't start with legal technicalities. You've always been difficult. This is simple. Sign the papers and we handle this as a family." Harper's husband stepped forward, jaw tight. "We've already talked to a builder. We can get the foundation poured before winter, but we need your signature this week." I stared at them, this group of people who had rehearsed this moment, who expected me to fold as easily as I had at the wedding. The weight of their entitlement settled over the porch like humidity. Harper's voice suddenly sharpened. "Dad promised me the land months ago. You're ruining everything." My father shot her a warning glare too late. There it was. The truth said out loud. Evelyn stepped up beside me, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough!" She pointed directly at my father. You lied. You've been lying to everyone about your rights. You signed away any claim years ago." My father's face twisted not in guilt but anger at being exposed. "You stay out of this, Evelyn," Harper rounded on her. "You've always taken her side. You never cared about me." Their shouting spilled into the yard, neighbors probably hearing every word. But for once I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to smooth anything. I closed the door enough to see only their faces through the narrow crack. "I will not sell the land. I will not sign anything. And I will not have this conversation without my attorney present." My father slammed a palm against the doorframe. "You're destroying this family." "No," I said quietly. "You did that yourself." I closed the door, fully engaging the deadbolt as their voices rose outside. After a minute, tires screeched and the shouting faded into the heat-soaked air. Evelyn sank into a chair, horrified by what she had just witnessed. "He won't stop," she whispered. "Not after today." I knew she was right. And as I picked up my phone, another voicemail from my father popped up. When I pressed play, his voice was low, threatening. "If you don't hand me those papers by Friday, you'll regret it. The developer doesn't like delays." My hands trembled not from fear this time, but from the certainty that I was done bending. If my father wanted a war, he was finally going to learn. I wasn't the quiet one anymore. I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, my father's voicemail replayed in my head, mixing with Harper's tears, and the echo of fists pounding on my door. By morning, the house felt charged, like the walls were bracing for impact. I made coffee I didn't drink and carried Dana's binder to the table, trying to steady my thoughts. I told myself I had a plan. I told myself I had protection. But none of it prepared me for the sound of tires on gravel outside. A black SUV rolled slowly into my driveway, sunlight glinting off its tinted windows. It didn't belong to any neighbor. It didn't belong to family. My pulse quickened as the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, mid-40s, clean-cut, wearing an expensive suit that didn't belong anywhere near farmland. He walked with deliberate calm, carrying a leather briefcase, like it weighed nothing. He knocked not forcefully, but with a confidence that announced he expected to be welcomed, Ms. Hartley, he called. "My name is Elias Crane. I represent Ridgeway Development Group. I believe we have mutual interests to discuss." My stomach dropped. The developer had a name now, a face, and it was standing on my porch like this was a scheduled appointment. I opened the door only a few inches, leaving the chain in place. "You shouldn't be here." He smiled, polite but unsettling. "I understand your caution. This is a sensitive matter. May we speak for a moment? No. Whatever you need, send it through my attorney." He tilted his head slightly. "Your father said you preferred straightforward communication." The coldness that washed over me felt physical. My father was feeding him lies again, and Elias was using them to wedge his way in. "I didn't authorize anything I said. I'm not selling my land." He regarded me with something between pity and calculation. "That's unfortunate. We've made significant plans with the understanding that your family was aligned in this effort. My family is not part of this decision. The land belongs solely to me." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. "That's precisely why I'm here." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Ridgeway is prepared to offer you far above market value, enough to settle certain complications your father may be facing, enough for your sister to build her future." I stiffened. So that was the angle: guilt, loyalty, obligation, all the levers my family had been pulling for years. He continued, "We're talking about a life-changing opportunity for everyone." I didn't take the folder he extended. My voice stayed flat. "I'm not interested." He withdrew the folder slowly, his expression tightening. "Ms. Hartley refusing to engage doesn't prevent progress. It complicates it." "Progress? You mean taking what isn't yours?" His smile faded completely. "I prefer to think of it as helping your family secure stability. They've expressed urgency." Your father implied. My father implied many things that aren't true. For the first time, Elias paused, not thrown off but recalculating. Then he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice as if confiding in me. We've already invested time and resources into this project. Walking away is not ideal for anyone. And delays? Well, delays can make things more difficult for all involved. A chill slid down my spine. This wasn't a negotiation. It was pressure wrapped in polite language. I'm calling my attorney, I said. He nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed irritation. Of course. But before I go, he reached into his briefcase again. Your father already provided preliminary documentation, a form indicating your intent to sell. He set a photocopy against the glass pane of my door so I could see it. My signature. The same forgery from the appraisal company now in a developer's hands. Elias watched my reaction carefully, like he was measuring my breaking point. That's not real, I said, each word slow and controlled. He slipped the page back into his folder. We assumed as much. But he assured us you were preparing to finalize things. He seemed confident. Confident. Another word for reckless. Another word for delusional. I've never signed anything. I will not sign anything. And if you or anyone from your company steps foot on my land again, I'll involve law enforcement. For a long beat, he simply studied me. Then he straightened, smoothing his jacket sleeves. Very well. But understand this, Ms. Hartley Ridgway does not handle uncertainty well. We expect clarity, and soon. He walked back to the SUV unhurried, as if he already knew the ending of a story I hadn't agreed to be part of. When he drove away, dust billowed behind his tires, drifting across the yard like smoke. I closed the door, my legs shaking. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I grabbed my phone and dialed Dana immediately. She answered on the second ring. Tell me everything, she said. I told her about the visit, the offer, the forged document, the veiled threats. She didn't interrupt, but I could hear her breath harden, her tone sharpen. Do not speak to him again, Dana said. Do not respond. Do not open your door to anyone you don't know. I'm filing motions today, and we're accelerating our plans. Plans. The word steadied me. After the call ended, I stepped onto the porch for air. That's when I noticed something tucked beneath the welcome mat. A yellow envelope. My name written on it. My chest tightened as I crouched and opened it. Inside were 3 things. A printed copy of the forged signature form, a zoning map of my land marked with red construction zones, and a handwritten note in unfamiliar scrawled ink. We'll be in touch. Don't make this difficult. The porch felt colder, the silence heavier. They had been here, on my property, at my door. And this wasn't pressure anymore. It was a warning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the yellow envelope beside me, its contents spread out like a threat spelled in ink. The forged signature, the zoning map, the slanted handwriting telling me not to make this difficult. I tried drinking tea, then coffee, then water. None of it touched the pounding in my chest. Around 3 a.m, I started a new binder labeled Land and Property Evidence and slid every document inside. My hands shook, but my mind was startlingly clear. By dawn, I was already driving to Dana's office, the sky still a pale blue wash behind the mountains. The roads were empty except for a few delivery trucks, and the hum of my tires felt too loud in the silence. I kept replaying Elias Crane's voice in my head, the way he said delays complicate things, the way he looked at me like I was a puzzle he fully intended to solve. Dana was waiting by the door when I arrived, a stack of papers in her hand. She ushered me straight into her conference room without a greeting. Sit, she said. Tell me everything from the moment he arrived. I told her. Every detail. The tone he used. The way he held the folder. The forged signature pressed against the glass. The veiled threats. The envelope under my welcome mat. When I finished, Dana's jaw was tight and she was already making notes. This changes everything, she said. We're dealing with more than property pressure. This crosses into coercion and possible fraud, and trespassing, and intimidation. My throat tightened. What do I do? Dana opened a red file tab like she had already anticipated the question. You have 4 options. None of them are perfect, but one is the most permanent. She slid a sheet of paper toward me. Option A, file a police report. Not yet, she said before I could speak. It might escalate things too quickly. Option B, seek an emergency injunction to prevent any land-related action. Option C, sue the developer and your father. Exhausting, long, public. Option D, transfer the land into a conservation trust. She paused. Irrevocable, untouchable, permanent protection. Not just for you, but forever. I stared at the paper. At first I only felt fear. Fear of losing something, fear of severing the last thread tying me to family. But then I remembered the footprints on my land, the forged signature, my father's voice calling me difficult, Elias's warning, Harper's sobbing accusation, my mother's letter, protect this place. What would you do? I asked quietly. Dana looked at me without hesitation. If your goal is temporary peace, seek the injunction. If your goal is permanent safety, choose conservation. Permanent. The words settled in my chest like a weight and a release at the same time. I ran a finger over the edges of the draft conservation agreement my mother had started years ago. The corners were worn, the ink fading, but the intention was intact. And now I understood why she never told my father about it. She knew. Long before I did, she knew. I lifted my eyes. I want permanent. Donna nodded once firmly approval, not judgment. Then we start today. She began gathering documents, flipping to a new tab. We'll file the intent to donate this afternoon. It's the first step. Once we sign the deed transfer later this week, the land won't be yours anymore. It won't belong to anyone. And no one, no developer, no family member, not even you will be able to undo it. I exhaled slowly. Good. She placed the intent form in front of me. Read it, then sign. Take your time. I read every word. The phrasing was technical, legal heavy, but between the lines I saw my mother's handwriting, her careful notes, her quiet fear that someday my father would try to tear apart what she loved. I saw myself at 12 hiding on the staircase while my parents argued. I saw the wedding the way my father couldn't look me in the eye when he ordered me to leave. I saw 40 acres of wild grass, tall trees, and the blue ridge my mother adored. I signed. Dana signed as witness. The notary added her stamp with a force that startled me as though sealing something sacred. This doesn't transfer the land yet, Dana said gently, but it sets the process in motion. My phone buzzed again. It hadn't stopped buzzing for a week. My father. I powered it off without looking. Dana packed the documents into an envelope ready to file. One more thing, she said. There's something I think you should know. She reached into her desk and pulled out an old inquiry form. Your mother contacted the Conservation Trust years ago. She never finalized the process, but she asked detailed questions. She wanted to understand the protections. I think she intended this for you. The room felt suddenly brighter, like sunlight through a cracked window. She was preparing me, I whispered. Dana nodded. On the drive home, I stopped at the edge of the property and walked into the open field. The morning air smelled like pine and earth. Birds moved in gentle arcs overhead. I placed my hand on the trunk of the nearest oak tree and closed my eyes. They won't touch you, I whispered. Not now. Not ever. When I returned to the house, an official county envelope was taped crookedly to my door. My heart jumped as I tore it open. A zoning meeting notice? 3 days from now. Attendance mandatory. At the bottom in my father's handwriting, we settle this then. I looked out across my land, the wind moving calmly through the grass, and felt something sharpen inside me. No. We settle it now. The zoning notice lay on my kitchen counter like a subpoena, its bold letters shouting louder than any voicemail my father had left. I reread the date 3 days from now and the words attendance required. Beneath that, his handwriting curved in a familiar, furious slant. "We settle this, then." My stomach nodded, but there was a new steadiness beneath the dread. I took a photo of the notice and texted it to Dana. 5 minutes later, she called. "They're escalating," she said. "This is a pressure tactic. They're trying to use the public forum to corner you. We'll prepare." Prepare. I clung to that word like a lifeline. Because while my father had always operated best in chaos, I was learning to operate in clarity. I didn't get clarity for long. By noon, my phone vibrated nonstop, buzz after buzz like a swarm of insects. I glanced at the screen and froze. I'd been added to a family group chat. I never asked for one, stacked with cousins, uncles, distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in months. The messages poured in faster than I could read them. "Your father says you're sabotaging the whole family. Harper needs that house. Why can't you just do the right thing? You're being cruel. Don't embarrass us at the meeting." One cousin wrote a paragraph claiming I was lashing out for attention. Another posted publicly on Facebook tagging me. "Some people don't care who they hurt as long as they stay in control." Control. That word landed like a punch. My father's favorite accusation whenever I told him no. I put the phone face down. The quiet that followed felt like mercy. Then it rang again, Evelyn. "Don't respond to any of them," she said without greeting. "They're repeating whatever your father told them. Lies. All of it. He's telling people you're mentally unstable, that you stole the land, that you're planning to disappear with the deed." My chest tightened. "He said that?" She sighed. "Honey, he's unraveling. He's desperate, and desperate people rewrite the truth to survive." I swallowed hard. "Is he coming to the meeting?" "He's the one who requested it," she said. "So yes, be ready." The readiness came faster than I expected. 3 days blurred into one long, buzzing ache of anticipation. When the zoning meeting night finally arrived, I drove to the municipal building with Dana beside me. The parking lot was already full pickup truck sedans and a shiny black SUV I recognized instantly. Elias Crane was here. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed above rows of metal folding chairs. People from town murmured among themselves, sipping coffee in styrofoam cups. A projector screen displayed the agenda: Ridgeway Development Proposal Preliminary Review. My hands went cold. Dana touched my elbow. "Remember, you are the landowner. You speak only facts." We sat in the second row. A few heads turned. Some whispered. One older woman gave me a pitying look, as if she believed the version of events she'd been fed. Elias began the presentation with practiced confidence. He spoke about opportunity, economic growth, job creation. He clicked through glossy renderings of luxury homes set neatly where my mother's wild fields now swayed in the real world. He praised the cooperation of the family. He spoke as though the project was already in motion, already approved, already waiting on a single missing signature. "The landowner has been difficult to reach," he said smoothly, "but we remain optimistic. We'll resolve the matter soon." Difficult. Again. That word again. A council member raised a hand. "Does the landowner approve this project?" Elias paused, his smile tightening. "Discussions are ongoing." Dana rose before I could. "Actually, she said they are not." She gestured toward me. "My client would like to respond." My legs shook as I stood, but my voice didn't betray it. "I have not authorized any part of this project. I have not given permission for any appraisal, inspection, or development. Any documents claiming otherwise contain a forged signature." A ripple moved through the room. Murmurs, gasps, confusion. Elias shifted in place, his confidence fracturing. My father shot to his feet. "She's lying," he shouted. "She's doing this to punish us. She's always been like this." Then Harper burst into tears loud enough to echo off the walls. "She wants to ruin my life. She wants to take everything from us." Her husband added his own outburst, pointing at me as though I'd committed a crime. "She's blocking our future. She's selfish." The room dissolved into noise. Dana stepped into the chaos like a blade. She presented the renunciation form my father had signed years ago. She distributed copies of the forged signature to the council members. She explained the trespassing, the threats, the coordinated manipulation. By the time she finished, the council members' discomfort had shifted into something closer to alarm. "We cannot move forward on this proposal," the chairperson finally announced. "Not until legal matters are resolved." Elias tightened his jaw. My father glared at me with something darker than anger, fear. Outside in the parking lot, he cornered me before I could reach my car. His face was flushed, his hands shaking. "You humiliated me," he said, voice low and trembling. "In front of the whole town. You ruined everything." I stepped back, keeping distance. "You ruined it yourself," Harper cried behind him, calling me a monster, a traitor, 1,000 things she never would have dared say when we were children. I opened my car door. "This land is mine," I said quietly, "and you are not entitled to it." My father's voice cracked, both angry and pleading. "This isn't over." I drove away without responding, my heart pounding against my ribs. But somewhere beneath the adrenaline, another feeling stirred, one I hadn't felt in years. Strength. This wasn't over. But neither was I. I woke the next morning to the sound of gravel crunching outside my window. For a split second, half asleep, I hoped it was Evelyn or Dana. Someone safe, someone steady. But when I pulled back the curtain, my breath caught. A white pickup truck I didn't recognize was parked at the edge of my field. 2 men stood beside it. Men I'd never seen before, both dressed in work boots and jackets, with the Ridgeway logo stitched on the sleeve. One held a clipboard. The other held a surveying pole. They were marking my land. I was outside in seconds, barely remembering to throw on a jacket. The cold air hit my lungs like a slap. "Hey!" I shouted. "This is private property." The man with the clipboard glanced up with thin irritation as though I were interrupting something mundane. "Morning, ma'am. We're here on a preliminary survey order for Ridgeway Development. You can't be here. I didn't authorize anything." He checked his paperwork. "We have a written confirmation from a family representative." My stomach twisted. My father again. "Of course." I stepped between them and the field. "You need to leave. Right now. Or I call the sheriff." The man at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job." "You're trespassing," I said. "And the next people you'll talk to will be law enforcement." I pulled out my phone and began dialing. That did it. They packed up their equipment quickly, muttering under their breath as they drove off. I kept recording until the truck was a speck on the road. When I sent the video to Dana, she replied almost instantly, "Save everything. No contact with them. I'll file an emergency cease and desist this morning." I sank onto the porch steps, letting the cold wood steady me. But the quiet didn't last long. My cousins started calling within the hour. First Liam, then Claire, then someone I barely knew named Marissa, who insisted we were close as kids, even though she once stole my bike and blamed me for losing it. Each voicemail was angrier than the last. "Karen, you're blowing this out of proportion. Your father is beside himself. Harper is devastated. Just sign the paperwork and end this." One message made me slam the phone down so hard it rattled the table. "You've always been ungrateful. Ungrateful. Despite everything I had endured to keep this family together, despite being ignored, blamed, used, dismissed. Ungrateful was the word they chose." By noon, I turned my phone off and went outside to walk the ridge trail behind the house. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. The higher I climbed, the more the world opened, rolling fields, the creek carving silver lines through the valley, my mother's favorite overlook where she used to bring a thermos of coffee and watch the sunrise. Standing there, the panic in my chest softened. The land grounded me the way nothing else ever had. I looked to the east, toward the meadow where the surveyors had stood earlier. The thought of bulldozers tearing through it made my throat ache. The thought of Harper building a luxury house on the ridge, my ridge felt like grief. I was still standing there when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I'd forgotten to turn it off airplane mode. The screen showed an unread text from an unsaved number. "Meet me at the house. We need to talk. It's urgent. Dad." My stomach twisted. I nearly deleted it without responding. But something inside me, old habit, old hope, whispered, "What if he's finally ready to apologize? What if he finally understands I went home?" Slowly, cautiously. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw his car already there. He was waiting on the porch, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders tense. When he looked at me, his face wasn't angry. It was worn down, exhausted. For a moment, I didn't see the man who humiliated me at the wedding, or the man who forged my signature. I saw my father. "Karen," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I stayed at the bottom of the steps. "About what?" His jaw flexed. "I know things have gotten messy. Too messy. I didn't handle things right." A pause. A long one. I thought I was hearing the start of an apology. I felt myself soften just slightly until he continued. "But you're being unreasonable. You're making things harder than they need to be." All the softness hardened instantly. Harder for whom I asked, for everyone he snapped. Your sister, her future, my future, this family. There it was again, the refrain of a lifetime. My responsibility, their benefit. He stepped closer. "I need you to sign the land release, Karen. Today. I'm in trouble. Real trouble. People are expecting repayment. They're not patient. You signing fixes everything for him, and destroys everything for me." "You forged my signature," I said quietly. "You trespassed. You sent surveyors to my land." His nostrils flared. That was Harper's husband. He acted without asking. "I would never." "Don't lie. Not now." He scowled, then tried again, softer. "I'm trying to save us, Karen. Save us. Or save yourself." Maybe for the first time in my life, I let silence answer the question. He exhaled sharply. "Fine. If you won't help voluntarily." He pulled a document from his jacket pocket, crumpled at the edges as though he'd been gripping it hard. When he unfolded it, my blood ran cold. It was a petition declaring me mentally unfit to manage the property. He stepped forward. "If you don't sign, I'll file this first thing tomorrow. The land goes to Harper by default." "You'll lose it anyway." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "You'd do that to your own daughter." He didn't blink. "I'll do whatever I have to do." A coldness spread through me. Slow, steady, absolute. I walked up the porch steps, stopping inches from him. "You can file whatever you want. It won't matter." His expression flickered. "What do you mean?" I didn't answer. I simply walked past him, opened my door, and closed it firmly behind me. For the first time in my life, I watched my father walk away from my home powerless, furious, confused. He didn't know it yet, but I'd already taken the one thing he believed he could take from me. The land wasn't his to threaten anymore, and soon I would make that truth permanent. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of sky that warned of rain long before the first drop fell. I woke with a weight settled deep in my chest, but it wasn't dread this time. It was decision. Finality. The kind that didn't leave room for negotiation. Dana called just after 7. Her voice was brisk, clipped all business. "The trust documents are ready. We can sign today. Once we do, the land becomes protected immediately. Irrevocable. Irrevocable." The word echoed through me like a pulse. I'll be there in an hour, I said. Before I left, I walked the perimeter of the property one more time, the western fence line where the sun warmed the dry boards, the slope near the creek where wild mint grew the old cottonwood whose branches shaded the trail. My mother used to pause under that tree and close her eyes, letting the sound of the leaves settle her. I did the same, letting the wind whisper against my ears, letting the earth hold me steady. When I opened my eyes again, I knew this land wasn't just mine. It was a piece of every woman before me who had protected it. My grandmother, my mother, now me. I wouldn't be the one to let it fall. In Dana's office, the air smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon cleaner. She had stacked the documents neatly on the conference table, each tab marked in red. A notary sat beside her, flipping through a ledger. Dana met my eyes. Once we sign these and I file them with the county clerk this afternoon, no one, not your father, not Harper, not Ridgway, will ever be able to claim the land. For a moment, emotion rose thick in my throat. Not grief relief. Release. Let's do it, I said. She slid the first document toward me. Conservation Land Transfer, Irrevocable Trust. I picked up the pen. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried every memory tied to the land. My mother's laughter, my own scraped knees from childhood summers, nights under the stars with Harper before she grew sharp, jealous, grasping. I signed. Then the second document. And the third. The notary stamped each one with a firm, echoing thud. With every stamp, something inside me loosened, uncoiled, lifted. When the last page was done, Dana leaned back in her chair. It's official. The trust is active. You are no longer the sole owner. You're the donor. The land belongs to itself now. The truth hit slowly, spreading like dawn light. The land was safe. Forever. My phone buzzed against the table, my father again, then Harper. Then 2 more numbers I didn't recognize. I powered it off without reading a single notification. Dana slid her office phone toward me. Do you want to call him now? You don't have to, but you can. I hesitated only long enough to steady my breathing. I didn't want to call, but I needed to. There was a difference. I dialed my father's number without letting myself think too long. He answered on the second ring, already mid-sentence. Karen, listen to me. I talked to an attorney this morning and he said if we move fast, we can override any documents you. Dad, I said. He stopped. The silence sharpened. Karen, are you at the courthouse? Did you sign? Tell me you didn't do something stupid. Behind his words, I could hear a kind of frantic rustling papers maybe, or pacing, or fear clothed in anger. I looked at the pile of signed trust documents on the table, at Dana watching me with calm assurance, at the notary sealing her ledger. I breathed in once slowly. Dad, I said, listen carefully. I'm going to say this one time. He exhaled shakily. Oh, okay. I felt the moment before it arrived, like a door closing, like a tether snapping clean. It's not yours anymore. A beat of silence. Then another. Then, what? His voice cracked. Karen, what did you say? The trust document sat on the table between us, immovable as stone. The land is no longer mine, I said quietly. But it isn't yours. It isn't Harper's. It isn't Ridgway's. It's in a conservation trust now, permanently. No one can sell it. No one can build on it. No one can use it to pay off debt. His breathing grew ragged. You didn't. I did. He made a choked sound. Part disbelief, part fury. You've ruined me. Do you hear me? You've ruined this entire family. No, I said. I protected what needed to be protected, what you tried to take. You ungrateful, he sputtered. After everything I've done, you forged my signature. Silence again. You sent surveyors to trespass on my land. More silence. You tried to have me declared unfit. His breath hitched. That wasn't Karen, I was desperate. You don't understand what I'm dealing with. They want their money. They won't care about your trust. They'll come after me. And you just made things worse. The panic in his voice should have shaken me. But it didn't. My sympathy had been spent long ago. You made your choices, Dad. And now I've made mine. He was crying now, or raging, or both. I couldn't tell. His voice cracked into pieces. Karen, please. Please undo it. I'm begging you. I'm your father. No. The word felt like a full breath for the first time in years. I won't undo it. I won't go back. He inhaled sharply like he'd been slapped. Then low and trembling he whispered, You'll regret this. I didn't respond. I hung up. Dana gently slid the phone back across her desk. You did the right thing. I nodded, though my hands shook not from doubt, but from the adrenaline of claiming something I'd been denied my whole life. My right to say no, my right to protect myself, my right to end the cycle. Outside clouds finally broke, releasing a slow, soft rain, the kind that nourished deep into the soil, the kind that made new things grow. For the first time in a long time, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, the same might be true for me. Below is Chapter 11. As you requested, 700 to 800 words, first person past tense, no analysis, no formatting markers, no separators, no breaks except natural paragraphing. If you'd like, I can now write Chapter 12 with the full emotional payoff plus CTA. Would you like me to continue? The rain had stopped by the time I drove home from Dana's office, but the clouds still hung low over the ridge, heavy and bruised, like they hadn't made up their mind about letting go. The land looked different now, not changed outwardly, nothing so dramatic. But knowing it was no longer vulnerable, no longer something anyone could snatch from me, shifted something in the air. It felt taller somehow, older, anchored. I parked near the barn and stepped out, letting the damp earth soften under my boots. My breath rose in thin white curls in the cool air. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing for a hit. I wasn't waiting for the next demand, the next ultimatum, the next threat disguised as concern. The silence wasn't foreboding. It was peaceful. My phone buzzed inside my pocket, but I didn't rush to check it. I walked instead, following the familiar path toward the old cottonwood. When I reached the base of the tree, I touched the rough bark and closed my eyes, imagining my mother's hand pressed beside mine. I imagined her voice, soft, steady, certain, saying, You did exactly what I hoped you would one day be strong enough to do. When I finally made my way back toward the house, the phone buzzed again. I checked the screen. A text from Harper. I read it once, then again. You destroyed this family. I hope you're happy. There was no apology, no recognition of what they had done. Only blame, only anger, only the certainty that my refusal to be used made me cruel. I deleted the message without answering. Half an hour later, a voicemail from my father arrived, though I didn't listen to that one either. The preview line was enough. I needed that land, Karen. Always need, always take, always expect someone else, usually me, to carry the cost. But the cost wasn't mine anymore. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea and watched the sun start its slow descent behind the hills. The light spilled gold across the fields, turning every blade of grass into something luminous. A hawk circled overhead, dipping once before soaring higher, free and unbothered by anything happening below. My fingers loosened around the mug. My shoulders sank from a tension I hadn't even realized was still there. A car approached sometime after sunset, slow, hesitant, creeping along the gravel like whoever was inside wasn't sure they should be here. I stood, heart quickening, but not with fear, with curiosity. Evelyn stepped out, her expression soft, tentative. She held a cardboard box in both hands. "I brought you something," she said, lifting it slightly. Inside were old photos of my mother, of me as a child of the land before the barn was rebuilt. Letters my mother had written to my grandmother. A newspaper clipping about the conservation efforts in our county from years ago. And at the very top, a photo I'd never seen. My mother, younger than I ever remembered her, standing with me on her hip and pointing toward the ridge, smiling like she knew exactly what this place would mean to me one day. I swallowed hard. "Thank you." Evelyn looked at me with a mixture of sadness and pride. "He won't understand what you did. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I do. Your mother would too." I nodded, blinking back, the heat behind my eyes. "I know." She hesitated on the porch step. "If it means anything, I'm proud of you. I should have stopped him sooner. I should have spoken up years ago. You did today," I said. "That counts." She smiled, hugged me lightly, and left without adding anything else. Some truths didn't need long speeches. After she drove away, the night deepened into a soft navy blue. Crickets began their steady chorus. I stayed outside, breathing in the cool air, letting my heartbeat settle into something calm and sure. When I finally went inside, I turned my phone back on, not because I needed to talk to anyone, but because I wanted to hear nothing more my father or Harper might say. I wanted the silence, the finality. 3 new messages appeared, all from unknown numbers, likely cousins or people trying to sway me. I deleted them all without opening a single one. Then I opened a blank document on my laptop and began writing a letter to myself. A letter I wished someone had written for me years ago, when I first learned how easy it was for people to demand pieces of me as if I owed them. The letter began simply, "You are allowed to protect what is yours." I wrote until my shoulders loosened, until my breathing steadied, until the last weight left my chest. Outside, the land stretched quiet and unbroken under the night sky. Safe. Whole. Mine to love, not to defend. Before bed, I stepped back onto the porch one last time. The stars were bright, glittering against the darkness like tiny lanterns scattered across a vast ceiling. I whispered into the quiet to my mother, to the land, to the girl I once was, who thought she had to earn love through sacrifice. "It's safe now." The wind answered softly, brushing warm against my face. If you've ever had to stand up to the people who were supposed to protect you, if you've ever had to reclaim something they thought you'd hand over quietly, then you know what this moment feels like. Tell me in the comments, what did this story stir in you? What would you have done in my shoes? Your voices matter more than you think. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of courage, justice, and reclaiming your worth, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe, stay with us, and watch the next story waiting for you on the screen. I promise it's one you won't want to miss.